Most hydrangeas don't actually die because they're difficult plants. They die because gardeners unknowingly make the same mistakes year after year. One wrong pruning cut, one poorly drained planting hole, or simply putting the wrong variety in the wrong location can mean an entire season without flowers. Even worse, many people assume the plant is beyond saving, dig it up, and replace it, when the real problem was never the hydrangea in the first place. The truth is that experienced growers don't have secret fertilizers or miracle products. They simply understand how hydrangeas grow, when they form flower buds, and what they need at different times of the year. Once you understand those few principles, you'll realize these plants are among the most rewarding shrubs you can grow. Today, I'm going to walk you through the exact practices experienced hydrangea growers use to keep their plants healthy, vigorous, and covered in blooms year after year. Some of these tips may completely change the way you've been caring for your hydrangeas, especially if you've been following generic gardening advice that treats every hydrangea exactly the same. Because that's the biggest mistake of all. Not all hydrangeas grow the same way. Not all hydrangeas bloom on the same type of wood. Not all hydrangeas want the same amount of sunlight. And certainly not all hydrangeas should be pruned at the same time. Understanding those differences is often the deciding factor between a shrub that looks lifeless every summer and one that becomes the centerpiece of your garden. But before we get started, before we dive into today's video, I have a major announcement. The gardening guide you've been writing to me about for months is finally here. The Plant Once Garden is officially out. You have been incredibly patient with me while I took the time to get this right. It is approximately 150 pages of everything this channel teaches, gathered into one complete reference, designed with a hand-drawn heritage cover and warm cream pages that feel like a guide your grandmother would have owned. Inside, you'll find the 90 perennial plants that come back every year with almost no labor, 6 complete garden plans, the no-labor planting calendar, and the hydrogen peroxide method explained completely. I've also included the specific perennials that bring hummingbirds singing and dancing right outside your window, the chapter on what your garden becomes over 20 years, and the mistakes that kill perennials. This is a reference you can lean on for the rest of your gardening life. You can scan the QR code on your screen right now, or click the link in the pinned comment or description below to get your copy. Thank you again for your patience. Now, back to the garden. 1. Identify old wood versus new wood before pruning. The #1 cause of no blooms. If there is one mistake that causes more disappointment than any other, it's pruning at the wrong time. Every year, countless gardeners cut back perfectly healthy hydrangeas in late winter or early spring because they assume they're doing the plant a favor. A few months later, the shrub fills with fresh green leaves, appears healthy enough, but never produces a single flower. Naturally, many people blame the fertilizer, the weather, or even the nursery where they bought the plant. In reality, the flower buds were accidentally removed months earlier. The first thing experienced growers identify before making a single pruning cut is whether they're hydrangea flowers on old wood or new wood. That distinction changes everything. Old wood simply refers to stems that grew during the previous season and survived through winter. New wood refers to fresh stems that emerged during the current growing season. Different hydrangea species produce their flower buds on different types of growth. Big leaf hydrangeas, known botanically as Hydrangea macrophylla, bloom on old wood. Oak leaf hydrangeas, Hydrangea quercifolia, also bloom on old wood. That means the flower buds for next year's display are already developing on this year's stems long before winter arrives. If you prune those stems during late winter or early spring, you're not just removing branches, you're removing the flowers before they ever have the opportunity to bloom. This is why experienced growers rarely touch these varieties until immediately after flowering has finished. Once the blooms begin fading during mid to late summer, usually between July and August, depending on your climate, there's still enough growing season left for the shrub to produce new stems and begin forming next year's flower buds. That timing is incredibly important. Wait too long into autumn, and the plant begins preparing for dormancy instead of producing replacement growth. Prune too early in spring, and the flower buds you've waited all year to see disappear with every cut. On the other hand, Panicle hydrangeas, Hydrangea paniculata, and smooth hydrangeas, Hydrangea arborescens, behave completely differently. These varieties bloom on new wood. Their flowers develop on stems produced during the current growing season. Because of that, experienced growers aren't afraid to prune them much harder while the plants are still dormant in late winter or early spring, generally between February and March, before vigorous new growth begins. A proper spring pruning encourages thicker stems, stronger branching, and larger flower heads throughout summer. In fact, these varieties often respond positively to pruning because it channels the plant's stored energy into producing fewer but much stronger shoots. This is one of the biggest reasons gardeners become confused. One neighbor may cut their hydrangea almost to the ground every spring and enjoy spectacular blooms. Another gardener follows the exact same advice on a different hydrangea species and unknowingly removes every flower bud the plant had prepared. Both gardeners believe they're doing the right thing. Only one actually is. Before reaching for your pruning shears, take a moment to identify which hydrangea you have growing in your garden. That single step could save an entire blooming season. A useful habit practiced by experienced growers is to label new hydrangeas as soon as they're planted. A small weather-resistant plant tag noting the variety and whether it blooms on old wood or new wood removes all uncertainty years later when pruning season arrives. It's a simple habit that prevents expensive mistakes. Another thing professionals pay attention to is the health of each stem before deciding whether it needs removal. Not every brown-looking stem is actually dead. After winter, many healthy stems remain dormant longer than expected, especially in colder climates. Instead of cutting immediately, experienced growers perform what's often called the scratch test. Using a clean fingernail or the edge of a small knife, gently scrape away a tiny section of the outer bark. If you see moist green tissue underneath, that stem is still alive and capable of supporting new growth. If the tissue underneath is dry and brown, the stem has died and can safely be removed. This simple test prevents gardeners from accidentally removing living stems that are merely slow to wake up in spring. It's especially valuable after unusually harsh winters, when some branches may have survived while others have not. Another common mistake is removing too many stems at once. Hydrangeas perform best when pruning focuses on improving structure rather than dramatically reducing size. Experienced growers remove dead wood first, then damaged branches, then any stems rubbing against each other before making additional shaping cuts if needed. This gradual approach preserves the shrub's natural framework while improving air circulation throughout the plant. Better airflow means foliage dries faster after rain, reducing the risk of common fungal diseases later in the season. It also allows sunlight to reach more of the developing stems, encouraging stronger overall growth. Remember, pruning isn't about cutting as much as possible. It's about making the right cuts at the right time for the specific hydrangea you're growing. Once you understand whether your shrub blooms on old wood or new wood, you'll avoid the #1 mistake responsible for thousands of flowerless hydrangeas every single year. And that's the foundation for everything else we're going to cover next. Because even perfectly pruned hydrangeas can struggle if they're planted in the wrong soil, which brings us to the next mistake experienced growers never overlook. As important as proper pruning is, even the healthiest hydrangea will eventually struggle if its roots are sitting in the wrong environment. One of the most common problems experienced growers encounter isn't visible above the soil at all. It's happening underground. 2. Prevent the bathtub effect and root rot with proper soil drainage. When gardeners think a hydrangea needs more water, they often give it exactly that. Ironically, too much water trapped around the roots is one of the fastest ways to lose a hydrangea. Hydrangeas certainly appreciate consistent moisture, but they absolutely hate sitting in stagnant, waterlogged soil. Their roots need moisture, but they also need oxygen. When the soil stays saturated for long periods, the tiny air spaces between soil particles fill with water instead of air. Without enough oxygen, healthy roots begin to suffocate. Once that happens, opportunistic fungi quickly move in. The result is root rot. Unfortunately, root rot often fools gardeners because the symptoms above ground look exactly like drought stress. The leaves begin to wilt. The plant appears weak. Growth slows dramatically. Flower production declines. Naturally, many people assume the shrub needs even more water, which only makes the problem worse. Experienced growers know the difference. Before reaching for the watering can, they first check the condition of the soil. If the ground feels constantly soggy several inches below the surface, watering isn't the solution. Improving drainage is. One of the biggest causes of poor drainage is something landscapers commonly call the bathtub effect. It happens more often than many gardeners realize. Imagine digging a deep hole into heavy clay soil, then filling only that planting hole with rich compost or bagged garden soil before placing the hydrangea inside. At first, it seems like the perfect planting method. The soil is soft. The roots are surrounded by organic matter. Everything looks healthy. But after the first heavy rain, that planting hole begins acting like a bathtub buried underground. Water drains easily through the loose amended soil, but then hits the surrounding dense clay, where it can't escape quickly enough. Instead of moving outward into the surrounding ground, the water collects around the root ball and remains trapped. For days, sometimes even longer. Over time, the constantly wet conditions deprive the roots of oxygen, encouraging decay instead of healthy growth. This is why experienced growers don't simply improve the planting hole. They improve the entire planting area whenever possible. Instead of creating a pocket of soft soil surrounded by dense clay, they gradually blend organic matter into a much wider section of soil so water can move naturally through the landscape instead of becoming trapped. Just as important is the planting depth. Hydrangeas should never be buried too deeply. The root flare, that point where the main stems widen and meet the root system, should sit slightly above the surrounding soil level. Generally, experienced growers position the root flare about 1 to 2 inches higher than the surrounding grade. That slight elevation allows excess water to drain away naturally instead of pooling around the base of the plant. It may not seem like much, but over the course of an entire growing season, those extra inches can make a tremendous difference. Another mistake is piling heavy soil or mulch directly against the woody stems. The base of the plant should remain exposed to circulating air. When soil or mulch stays packed tightly around the stems, moisture remains trapped against the bark, increasing the likelihood of rot and encouraging pests to move in. Instead, spread mulch around the drip line, leaving a small gap of several inches around the crown of the plant. This simple adjustment keeps moisture where the roots need it, while allowing the stem bases to stay dry. Container-grown hydrangeas present another challenge. Many gardeners choose decorative pots without paying much attention to drainage. A beautiful container becomes a serious problem if excess water has nowhere to escape. Experienced growers always check the bottom of the container before planting. Large, unobstructed drainage holes are absolutely essential. If decorative liners or trays collect water underneath the pot, they are emptied regularly rather than allowing the container to sit in standing water. A hydrangea growing in a container depends entirely on the gardener to provide proper drainage. Unlike plants growing in open ground, container roots have nowhere else to send excess water. Soil choice also matters. Heavy garden soil often becomes compacted inside pots, restricting both drainage and airflow. Instead, experienced growers use a high-quality planting mix designed to retain moisture while still allowing excess water to drain freely. That balance is exactly what hydrangeas prefer. Consistently moist, never constantly soaked. One habit that separates experienced growers from beginners is that they don't water according to the calendar. They water according to the condition of the soil. Instead of assuming every hydrangea needs water every 2 or 3 days, they simply check the soil first. Insert a finger several inches into the soil near the root zone. If it still feels cool and moist beneath the surface, watering can wait. If the soil has begun drying several inches down, it's time for a deep soak. This approach prevents both underwatering and overwatering while encouraging deeper, stronger root systems. It's also worth paying attention to where rainwater naturally collects in your yard. Low spots that remain wet long after a storm are rarely ideal places for hydrangeas. Even if the shrub survives, prolonged periods of saturated soil, often lead to reduced vigor, smaller flower heads, and increased disease pressure over time. When planting in challenging locations, experienced growers sometimes build slightly raised planting beds to improve drainage naturally. Raising the planting area by even a few inches can dramatically reduce the risk of waterlogged roots during periods of heavy rainfall. If your hydrangea already shows signs of declining health, don't immediately assume it's beyond saving. Carefully inspect the planting site. Is the soil remaining wet for several days after rain? Is the root flare buried beneath layers of mulch? Does water pool around the base after watering? Answering those questions often reveals the real problem long before replacing the plant becomes necessary. Hydrangeas are remarkably resilient once their roots have access to both moisture and oxygen. Get that balance right, and you've solved one of the biggest causes of long-term decline. But healthy roots alone won't guarantee spectacular blooms. Even perfectly drained soil can't compensate for the wrong amount of sunlight. And that's where many gardeners unknowingly hold their hydrangeas back without ever realizing it. Which brings us to the next secret. Experienced growers always pay close attention to. 3. Match sunlight to the botanical species. One of the biggest myths surrounding hydrangeas is that they all love shade. It's advice that's been repeated for decades, and while it contains a grain of truth, it's also responsible for countless underperforming shrubs. The reality is far more specific. Different hydrangea species evolved under different growing conditions, and they respond very differently to sunlight. Treating every hydrangea the same almost always leads to disappointment. Experienced growers don't simply ask, "Does this plant like sun or shade?" Instead, they ask, "Which species am I growing?" That single question determines where the plant will thrive and where it will struggle. Panicle hydrangeas are by far the most sun-tolerant of the commonly grown hydrangeas. In fact, they perform best with at least 6 hours of direct sunlight each day. That abundant light fuels sturdy stem development, larger flower clusters, and more vigorous overall growth. When panicle hydrangeas are planted in excessive shade, they often produce long, weak stems that stretch toward available light. The result is a shrub that looks thin, floppy, and unable to support its own flower heads. Many gardeners mistakenly blame the variety itself when the real issue is simply a lack of sunlight. Give a panicle hydrangea the bright conditions it prefers, and its structure becomes noticeably stronger from season to season. Big leaf hydrangeas, however, tell a very different story. Unlike panicle varieties, they perform best with gentle morning sun, followed by protection from the hottest afternoon rays, particularly in warmer climates. Morning sunlight provides enough energy for healthy flowering without exposing the broad leaves to the intense heat that builds later in the day. By early afternoon, especially during summer, those large leaves begin losing moisture rapidly if exposed to prolonged direct sun. The result is scorched leaf edges, faded flowers, and unnecessary stress that weakens the entire plant. In cooler northern climates, big leaf hydrangeas can often tolerate a bit more direct sunlight than they can farther south. But regardless of location, experienced growers always observe how the plant responds rather than relying solely on general recommendations. The leaves tell the story. If they remain lush and upright through the afternoon, the location is likely suitable. If they consistently droop, scorch, or develop brown edges despite adequate soil moisture, the plant is asking for more protection from intense afternoon sun. Mountain hydrangeas share similar preferences. They appreciate bright morning light, but they also benefit from afternoon shade, especially during periods of prolonged summer heat. Although generally more cold-hardy than many big leaf varieties, they still respond poorly to excessive heat stress. Experienced growers understand that sunlight is never just about the number of hours. It's also about the quality and timing of that light. As you've probably noticed by now, keeping a hydrangea alive isn't about finding one miracle product or following one universal rule. It's about giving the plant exactly what it needs at the right time. Proper pruning protects the flower buds. Healthy soil protects the roots. The right amount of sunlight keeps the plant vigorous. Now let's look at another mistake that quietly robs hydrangeas of their flowers every single year. 4. Stop over-fertilizing with high nitrogen. One of the biggest misconceptions in gardening is that more fertilizer automatically means more flowers. Experienced growers know the opposite is often true. Hydrangeas are not heavy feeders, and applying too much fertilizer, especially products high in nitrogen, can create a shrub that's full of beautiful green leaves, but disappointingly few blooms. Nitrogen is essential for plant growth. It promotes lush foliage, vigorous stems, and rapid vegetative development. But when it's supplied in excessive amounts, the plant naturally directs more of its energy toward producing leaves rather than flowers. The result is a shrub that appears healthy at first glance, but consistently underperforms when bloom season arrives. Many gardeners unknowingly create this problem by applying lawn fertilizer near their hydrangeas. Most lawn fertilizers are formulated with high nitrogen because grass benefits from continuous leafy growth. Hydrangeas don't. When those nutrients wash into nearby flower beds after rain or irrigation, the shrubs receive far more nitrogen than they actually need. Experienced growers are careful about where and how fertilizer is applied, especially if hydrangeas are planted close to the lawn. Another common mistake is feeding too often throughout the growing season. Some gardeners fertilize every few weeks, believing they're giving the plant constant encouragement. Instead, they create soft, fast-growing stems that remain tender well into autumn. As temperatures begin dropping, those immature stems haven't fully hardened. They're much more vulnerable to winter injury, which can reduce flowering the following year, especially on old wood varieties. That's why experienced growers prefer a far simpler approach. In early spring, as new growth begins emerging, they apply a single balanced, slow-release fertilizer, or, even better, spread a generous layer of finished compost around the drip line. That provides a steady supply of nutrients without forcing excessive growth. Compost offers another important advantage. In addition to feeding the plant gradually, it improves soil structure, encourages beneficial microbial activity, and helps the soil retain moisture without becoming waterlogged. Instead of feeding the plant alone, it improves the entire growing environment. Once mid-June arrives, experienced growers generally stop fertilizing altogether. At that point, the goal shifts from producing rapid new growth to allowing existing stems to mature and prepare for dormancy. This natural hardening process is especially important in regions with cold winters. Late-season fertilization interrupts that process and leaves tender shoots vulnerable when freezing temperatures arrive. It's also worth remembering that healthy leaves don't always indicate a healthy feeding program. Hydrangeas, with unusually large dark green leaves but very few flowers, are often receiving too much nitrogen. Conversely, a shrub with moderate, balanced growth and abundant blooms is usually getting exactly what it needs. In gardening, balance almost always produces better long-term results than excess. Experienced growers rarely chase dramatic growth. They focus on consistent, healthy growth that supports reliable flowering year after year. If you've been feeding your hydrangeas regularly and wondering why they still refuse to bloom, it may be worth reducing fertilizer rather than adding more. Sometimes doing less produces far better results. By the way, if you're looking to completely transform your yard into a low-maintenance paradise, don't forget that my full reference guide, The Plant Once Garden, is now officially available. It's 150 pages, covering all the perennial foundations and permanent setups we talk about on this channel. You can scan the QR code right here on the screen, or find the link in the pinned comment below to grab your copy. Now, let's get right back into today's topic. 5. Match the variety to your specific USDA hardiness zone. Another reason hydrangeas struggle has nothing to do with pruning, watering, or fertilizer. It begins the moment they're purchased. Garden centers often display beautiful hydrangeas in full bloom, making it easy to fall in love with a particular variety without considering whether it's actually suited to your local climate. Experienced growers never buy a hydrangea based on appearance alone. They first ask whether it's appropriate for their USDA hardiness zone. That single decision often determines whether the shrub thrives for decades or becomes a constant source of frustration. Hardiness isn't simply about whether the roots survive winter. For many hydrangeas, especially those that bloom on old wood, Flower bud survival is equally important. A plant may survive every winter perfectly well while producing almost no flowers because its buds are repeatedly damaged by freezing temperatures. That's why selecting the right species for your climate matters so much. For gardeners in USDA zones 3 through 8, panicle hydrangeas are among the most dependable choices available. Popular varieties such as Limelight and Bobo tolerate extremely cold winters while flowering reliably on new growth each year. Even if severe winter weather damages the previous season's stems, fresh spring growth still produces abundant blooms. Smooth hydrangeas, including the well-known Annabelle, perform in a similar way. Because they bloom on new wood, winter stem damage rarely prevents flowering. These varieties provide dependable performance in regions where temperatures regularly fall well below freezing. Big leaf and oak leaf hydrangeas generally perform best in USDA zones 5 through 9. In these regions, winter temperatures are usually moderate enough to protect the stems that carry next year's flower buds. However, gardeners in Zone 5 face a unique challenge. Even after surviving winter successfully, flower buds can still be destroyed by unexpected late spring frosts. Everything may appear healthy until bloom season arrives. The leaves emerge normally. The shrub looks vigorous. Yet almost no flowers appear because the developing buds were damaged during a single cold night. Experienced growers in colder regions often choose reblooming cultivars such as Endless Summer. Unlike traditional big-leaf hydrangeas, these varieties have the ability to flower on both old and new growth. Even if some overwintering buds are lost, fresh growth later in the season can still produce flowers, providing much greater reliability. Gardeners living in USDA zones 8 and 9 face an entirely different set of challenges. Extreme summer heat becomes the primary concern rather than winter cold. In these warmer climates, experienced growers pay particular attention to afternoon shade, consistent soil moisture, and generous mulching to reduce heat stress. Without that additional protection, prolonged periods of intense heat can reduce flowering, scorch foliage, and shorten the life of the blooms. Choosing the right hydrangea isn't about selecting the prettiest flowers at the nursery. It's about selecting a plant that's naturally adapted to the conditions it will experience every year. A variety that's perfectly suited to your climate will always outperform one that's constantly struggling against it. That's why experienced growers spend just as much time researching the plant before purchasing it as they do caring for it afterward. A little planning at the beginning often prevents years of unnecessary disappointment. 6. Protect overwintering stems from late spring frosts. Even after choosing the right variety for your climate, nature can still throw an unexpected challenge your way. One unusually cold night in early spring is sometimes all it takes to erase months of healthy flower development. This is especially true for hydrangeas that bloom on old wood. Many gardeners assume the harshest part of winter is the greatest threat. Surprisingly, experienced growers often worry more about spring than winter itself. Here's why. Throughout winter, hydrangeas remain dormant. Their flower buds are tightly closed and naturally protected against cold temperatures. As the days become longer and temperatures begin warming in late winter and early spring, those buds gradually awaken. They become swollen, tender, and much more vulnerable. Then comes the problem. A sudden freeze arrives after several mild days. Temperatures drop well below freezing overnight. By morning, those developing buds have been damaged or killed. The shrub itself usually survives. The stems remain alive. The leaves often emerge normally, but the flowers never appear. This is one of the most frustrating situations gardeners experience, because the plant doesn't look dead. It simply refuses to bloom. Experienced growers prepare for this possibility long before spring arrives. In colder regions, particularly USDA zones 4 through 6, protecting old wood hydrangeas begins in late autumn. After the leaves have fallen and the plant has entered dormancy, many gardeners wrap the shrub loosely with breathable burlap. This creates a protective barrier against drying winter winds while helping moderate sudden temperature swings. Others build a simple cylinder of wire fencing around the shrub and gently fill the space with dry leaves. That blanket of trapped air acts as natural insulation throughout winter, helping protect the valuable flower buds inside. Whatever method is used, one rule remains constant. The covering should allow airflow. Hydrangeas should never be wrapped tightly in plastic, which traps moisture and encourages rot, mold, and fungal problems during winter. Protection should insulate without sealing the plant away. As winter gives way to spring, experienced growers don't immediately discard their protective materials. Instead, they keep frost cloths or lightweight garden fabric within easy reach. Weather forecasts can change quickly, and a surprise freeze warning often provides only a day's notice. When freezing temperatures threaten after buds have begun swelling, temporarily covering the shrub overnight can make the difference between a spectacular flowering season and one with almost no blooms. The cover is removed once temperatures rise the following morning, allowing normal airflow and sunlight to return. It's a simple precaution that often saves an entire season's display. Experienced growers understand that protecting flower buds isn't something you do only after damage occurs. It's something you prepare for well in advance. And that small amount of preparation is often what separates consistently beautiful hydrangeas from shrubs that bloom beautifully one year and disappoint the next. But even perfectly protected hydrangeas can struggle if they're watered incorrectly, and that's where another surprisingly common mistake catches many gardeners off guard. Even if you've mastered pruning, improved your soil, matched your hydrangea to the right climate, and protected it from late frosts, there are still two areas that experienced growers never overlook. One involves how the plant receives water. The other involves understanding the chemistry happening beneath the soil. Together, these final secrets often make the difference between a hydrangea that merely survives and one that produces spectacular blooms year after year. 7. Manage water frequency and avoid leaf splashing. Hydrangeas have earned a reputation for being thirsty plants, and to a certain extent, that's true. Their large leaves lose moisture quickly during warm weather, and their impressive flower heads require a steady supply of water to remain full and vibrant. But experienced growers know that how you water is every bit as important as how often you water. One of the biggest mistakes gardeners make is giving their hydrangeas a light sprinkle every evening. The surface soil becomes damp for a short time, but very little moisture actually reaches the deeper roots where it's needed most. As a result, the roots stay close to the surface, constantly searching for moisture. That shallow root system becomes extremely vulnerable during hot weather, because the upper few inches of soil dry out first. Experienced growers encourage roots to grow downward instead. Rather than watering a little every day, they water deeply once or twice each week, depending on rainfall, soil type, and temperature. A slow, thorough soaking allows moisture to penetrate well below the surface, encouraging the roots to follow. Over time, the plant develops a much stronger, more resilient root system that's better equipped to handle short periods of dry weather. This simple change alone often transforms the health of a struggling hydrangea. Another common mistake is relying on overhead sprinklers. While sprinklers may seem convenient, they repeatedly soak the leaves and flowers, especially during warm, humid weather. Moist foliage that remains wet for hours creates ideal conditions for fungal diseases to develop. Powdery mildew is one of the most recognizable problems. It appears as a white, dusty coating on the leaves, reducing their ability to photosynthesize efficiently and making the plant look unhealthy. Another disease experienced growers watch for is Cercospora leaf spot. Small purple or brown spots gradually spread across the foliage, eventually causing premature leaf drop if conditions remain favorable for the disease. Although these diseases rarely kill an established hydrangea, they weaken the plant and reduce its overall vigor, making future flowering less impressive. That's why experienced growers water at the base of the plant whenever possible. Whether using a watering can, a hose placed near the root zone, or a drip irrigation system, the goal is always the same. Deliver the water directly to the roots while keeping the foliage as dry as possible. Morning is generally the best time to water. If a small amount of moisture does reach the leaves, the rising sun and increasing air movement allow them to dry quickly. Evening watering, on the other hand, often leaves foliage damp throughout the night, giving fungal diseases several uninterrupted hours to establish themselves. Mulch also plays an important role in proper watering. A 2 to 3 inch layer of organic mulch spread around the drip line helps reduce evaporation, keeps soil temperatures more stable, and slows the growth of competing weeds. As the mulch gradually breaks down, it also contributes organic matter that improves soil structure over time. However, experienced growers never pile mulch directly against the woody stems. Instead, they leave a gap of about 3 inches around the base of the shrub. This allows air to circulate freely and prevents excess moisture from remaining trapped against the bark, reducing the risk of stem rot. One of the simplest habits professionals develop is learning to read the soil rather than following a fixed watering schedule. A week of cool, cloudy weather may require very little supplemental watering. A week of intense heat and strong winds may require considerably more. The calendar doesn't determine when a hydrangea needs water. The soil does. Before watering, experienced growers simply check several inches below the surface. If the soil is still cool and evenly moist, they wait. If it has begun drying at root depth, they water thoroughly. That approach provides exactly what the plant needs without creating unnecessary stress from either drought or overwatering. Consistency is the goal, not constantly wet, not constantly dry. Just evenly moist soil with good drainage. When that balance is achieved, hydrangeas reward the gardener with healthier foliage, stronger stems, and longer-lasting blooms. 8. Understand soil pH for color control, without chemical shock. Perhaps no subject creates more confusion than hydrangea flower color. Many gardeners have heard that adding coffee grounds, eggshells, vinegar, rusty nails, or various homemade remedies will magically turn pink flowers blue or blue flowers pink. Experienced growers know the process is far more precise than that. First, it's important to understand that not every hydrangea can change color. Only certain species, primarily big-leaf hydrangeas, Hydrangea macrophylla, and mountain hydrangeas, Hydrangea serrata, naturally respond to changes in soil chemistry. If you're growing a white-flowering variety such as Annabelle or Limelight, changing the soil's pH will not suddenly produce blue or pink flowers. White varieties remain white, regardless of soil chemistry. For hydrangeas capable of changing color, the deciding factor isn't simply soil acidity by itself. It's the availability of aluminum within the soil. In acidic soils, generally with a pH between 5.2 and 5.5, aluminum becomes more available for the roots to absorb. As aluminum moves through the plant, the flowers gradually develop beautiful shades of blue. When the soil becomes more alkaline, usually around pH 6.0 to 6.5, aluminum becomes far less available. Without that aluminum, the flowers naturally develop pink tones instead. The important point is that changing flower color is not an overnight process. Experienced growers never dump large quantities of sulfur, aluminum sulfate, or garden lime around a hydrangea hoping for instant results. Sudden, excessive changes in soil chemistry can stress the roots and disrupt the natural balance of beneficial soil organisms. Instead, they make gradual adjustments while monitoring the soil over time. Whenever possible, they begin with a soil test. Knowing the existing pH removes the guesswork and allows any amendments to be applied with much greater accuracy. It's a far better approach than blindly adding products without knowing whether they're actually needed. Patience also plays a role. Color changes often occur gradually over several growing seasons rather than immediately after one application. Experienced growers understand that lasting results come from slow, steady adjustments rather than dramatic interventions. Ultimately, flower color should be viewed as an interesting bonus rather than the primary measure of success. A vigorous hydrangea covered with healthy blooms will always be more rewarding than a stressed plant struggling to produce a particular shade. Healthy roots, proper pruning, good drainage, and appropriate watering will always have a greater impact on long-term performance than chasing flower color alone. Before we wrap up, there are two final details that many experienced growers quietly follow, even though they're rarely discussed. These aren't complicated techniques, but they often explain why one gardener enjoys reliable blooms year after year, while another continues struggling. For hydrangeas that bloom on old wood, Next year's flowers actually begin their journey much earlier than many people realize. Between late July and September, the plant starts forming the flower buds that will open the following growing season. That means this late summer period is one of the most important times of the entire year. If the plant experiences severe drought stress during these weeks, it may produce far fewer flower buds for the following season. Everything may appear perfectly healthy this year, yet next year's display can already be compromised. Experienced growers understand that the garden they're enjoying today was influenced by the care they provided months earlier. They continue watering deeply during extended dry spells in late summer, even after the current flowers have begun fading. That consistent care helps the plant complete bud formation successfully before entering dormancy. In many ways, next year's blooms are decided this autumn rather than next spring. The final secret begins on planting day. Many nursery-grown hydrangeas spend months developing inside containers. Over time, their roots begin circling around the inside of the pot, creating a dense, compact mass. If that root ball is planted exactly as it comes out of the container, those circling roots often continue growing in the same pattern instead of spreading outward into the surrounding soil. The result is a shrub that struggles to establish itself properly. It may wilt repeatedly during warm weather despite adequate watering because the roots never fully expand into their new environment. Experienced growers always inspect the root ball before planting. If the roots are tightly bound, they gently tease them apart by hand. When necessary, they make several shallow vertical cuts around the outside of the root ball with a clean knife. This process, often called scoring the root ball, encourages new roots to grow outward into the surrounding soil, rather than continuing to circle. Although it may seem counterintuitive to disturb healthy roots, this small step often makes the difference between a plant that merely survives and one that establishes quickly and grows vigorously for years to come. As you've seen throughout this video, hydrangeas aren't nearly as difficult as their reputation suggests. Most problems come down to a handful of avoidable mistakes. Knowing whether your variety blooms on old wood or new wood. Providing soil that stays moist without remaining waterlogged. Giving the right amount of sunlight for the species you're growing. Avoiding excessive nitrogen. Choosing varieties suited to your USDA hardiness zone. Protecting vulnerable flower buds from late spring frosts. Watering deeply instead of frequently. Understanding how soil chemistry influences flower color. And finally, paying attention to those small details, like late summer bud formation and properly preparing the root ball, that experienced growers quietly practice every season. None of these techniques require expensive equipment or complicated products. They simply require understanding how the plant naturally grows. Once you begin working with your hydrangea instead of against it, you'll often find that it rewards you with healthier foliage, stronger stems, and beautiful blooms for many years to come. If you're ready to stop wasting time on plants that die every winter and finally build a garden that takes care of itself, don't forget to grab your copy of The Plant Once Garden. It's 150 pages of everything this channel teaches, completely mapped out for you. Just scan the QR code on your screen right now, or click the link in the description below to get started. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.